All right. Hi, I think we're live. Thank you, everybody who's here. My name is Alissa Figueroa. I work for Type Media Center, for Type Investigations, actually. I'm a senior editor, and I'm the manager of our Ida B. Wells Fellowship. This is our Type Talks event. We do these about every month or so to talk about different stuff we're working on, different programs, different stories. And so today we're going to be talking a little bit about the fellowship that I manage. We have two of our fellows here from this last year. So I will introduce you ladies in one moment. But first, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the fellowship. The Ida B. Wells Fellowship, we started in 2016. Initially, we had 4 fellows that we worked with in each year. Now we have 5. It's a one-year fellowship. We go from June to June. And the point of it is to provide an opportunity for journalists of color who have not done their own investigative projects in the past to take on a big, ambitious story that they want to do. So we provide mentoring, editing, fact-checking. We provide a stipend at $16,000 over the course of the year, as well as cover reporting costs, travel costs, and we help place stories as well. So that's kind of the overview of the program. And so we have 2 of our fellows here who are going to join me today, and we're going to talk a little bit about their stories and also kind of their process, what it was like to go through this fellowship, what they learned from their stories, and a little bit about being a journalist of color taking on, big, major investigative project. So Andrea González-Ramírez, do you want to give a wave? It's Andrea. She's a senior writer at Gen. Previously, she worked at Refinery 29. She covers politics, women's issues. She's from Vega Alta, or Alta Vega.
Vega Alta.
Thank you, Puerto Rico. And she's based in New York City. And we have Annette Pember. Mary is a senior correspondent with Indian Country Today. She's based in Cincinnati, and she is a citizen of the Red Cliff Band of Ojibwe. To start off, I think in terms of our process today, we're going to spend the first 2/3 of our time, about 40 minutes, just having a conversation, the 3 of us, talking about the stories these 2 ladies pursued, have kind of a list of questions that we've come up together. But we want to hear from you. So if you have a question you'd like to ask, there's an Ask a Question button here at the bottom. You can click on it and put it in there. We will get to questions at the end. We'll leave about the last 20 minutes or so. So please go ahead and drop those in there. And yeah, we'll just get going. And I'm excited, and I know this is going to be a good conversation. Okay, so Andrea, why don't you start? Tell us a little bit about your story. What did you want to pursue, and what did you end up finding? Just give us a kind of big picture view on your project.
Yeah, so thank you for having me, Alissa. I spent a year looking into Puerto Rico's domestic violence epidemic. I'm from the island, and this is an issue that's kind of close to my heart. I have family members who are survivors, and this was also an issue I had reported on before. So over the past year or so, I was looking at how the government and specifically how the police handled these cases. After Hurricane Maria happened in 2017, the island saw an increase in the number of women who were killed by their intimate partners. And using that data point, I was like, okay, well, let's look at how, the government is, passing legislation or not. Let's look at how the police is looking into these cases or dealing with abusers and so on. What I found was there's a lot of flaws in the system that have been there for a long time and have not been fixed yet. Specifically with the police, I found that they take forever to answer 911 calls. A lot of times they don't enforce protective orders, even though violating them is a criminal matter. So the police has a big issue with abusers within the force itself. Between 2015 and 2019, there were 449 police officers who were accused of domestic violence by their intimate partners or their former intimate partners. And out of everyone, just one case went to trial and ended up in a guilty conviction. So, this is an issue that advocates have been calling on the government to take seriously. We tried to contact the governor's office without luck for months. And yeah, like what we're seeing is that with this crisis that the island has seen in the past couple of years, right? Maria, the debt crisis, the earthquakes at the beginning of the year, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and also the coronavirus pandemic, like women in the island are super vulnerable and they're in this like abusive relationships, and the government is not really taking it seriously at all.
Thank you, Andrea. We'll come back to your story. I have a lot of questions. I want to get a little bit more in depth, but Mary, do you mind giving us also your kind of overview of what you looked into and what were some of your major findings in your investigation?
Yeah, I've been interested in Indian boarding schools for quite some time. My mother is a boarding school survivor, and she went to a Catholic boarding school. I started doing some investigation. I wanted to find her records, and all of the Catholic Indian boarding school records are stored at this archive at Marquette University in Milwaukee. And so I was able to go there, and I found her name, and it was a really powerful experience. I was writing about the impact of historical trauma on Native people, and so that was all during the course of that. So it was about like in 2014. While I was there, I noticed that there was a period of time in the beginning of the 20th century for a little over 60 years that Native people actually paid tuition to go to these Catholic Indian boarding schools, and I think some other religious boarding schools. So people were required by law to go to school in some way. They would, the government would withhold rations from people sometimes, and these are people who were cut off from their subsistence lifestyle. So that was a significant motivation for them to send their kids to school. The other thing is treaties over the years. Is like nearly 400 treaties rather than that Native peoples signed with the U.S. government. And in many of those treaties, education was promised in exchange for billions of acres of land. Also, subsequent legislation also promised education. So Native people had already paid for education. So I was sort of startled to find out, what's the deal with this? Why are they paying again, to go to these Catholic boarding schools? So the Catholics didn't make a secret of it necessarily, but it seemed like nobody really knew about it. And it bothered me. And I wondered, how many people are we talking about? How much money are we talking about here over this period of time? Diminishing, money for folks who were, because of their being placed on reservations and being cut off from their lifestyles, that were impoverished. And then further impoverished, by having to pay this tuition. So I thought I really wanted to know more about that. And I thought, well, how interesting it would be to assign a number. And so I was not able to find a number for every year, but I was able to find for 9 years, I was able to find information. And so we adjusted for inflation, and just for 9 years, it was like about $30 million. So thinking about that is, I think, pretty impressive, just that portion of that 60 years that our people paid that money. And the reason that they sent their children often to these Catholic boarding schools is frequently the federal boarding schools were built quite far away from reservations. And also the federal boarding schools in particular were very discouraging of parents ever visiting their children. They really very much discouraged that. But the Catholics would occasionally let people visit their children, and often they were located closer. So they would be maybe even on the reservation or within, a reasonable distance. And of course we have to think about for the up until, into the 60s, certainly transportation in these rural reservations was not available to people. So people, walking even, in some of these northern areas, walking 2 miles, in 20 below weather for a child is, restrictive. So people were keenly, interested in having their children go to school that was, at least close enough to their home they could see their child occasionally, and that it would not be, dangerous for them to attend. So people, quote unquote, chose to send their children, but it was not like a choice in which we typically think of a choice. A choice is something we make from a position of power. I think people were not empowered to make this. It was like sort of by default. It's like, well, this is something marginally better that I can offer my children. So that was really good to shine a light on that, I think, for people and certainly for myself.
One thing I thought was kind of amazing about for both of you working with you over the course of the year on your stories was like the lengths to which both of you had to go to get your stories. There were like derailed trips, there were natural disasters, there was like Mary driving through blizzards in northern Minnesota and like visiting all these archival I just want people to understand a little bit kind of like what it took for you guys to tell these stories, because I think it helps folks understand why doing a big ambitious project like this is hard, for people who aren't given the resources and the priority and the space and the mentorship and guidance to kind of do, to get the piece to the finish line. So Mary, since you just talked, can you talk a little bit about kind of your historic archival research? Like, how did you determine these schools were running, some of them 100 years ago? How did you figure out what these treaties officially laid out, how much money was going specifically from families to the Catholic Church, how it was being rerouted? Can you just talk through your process of reporting a little bit?
Well, I think to do this work, you have to be a little bit obsessed, like actually a lot obsessed. So, once and you get your teeth into it and it gets in your blood and you can't let go. And I think that if you talk to a lot of us doing this kind of work, you'll find that we have that kind of a spirit, that's the spirit that we bring to it. The archives actually at Marquette are very extensive. Like the National Archives is supposed to have copies of all of that materials, but they at least in relationship to enrollment. But they're disparate. They're all over the country. They could be in Seattle, they could be in Kansas City, they could be in Chicago. And the indexing system changed over the years as the federal bureaucracy would change, and actually they named the agency different names. It was not always the Bureau of Indian Affairs as we know it now. So it's really like finding a needle in a haystack, in many ways looking at the National Archives. Sometimes you can just find stuff, but the great thing about Marquette, they have everything relating to Catholics there. And it's not really that indexed that well. You have to be willing to wade through a lot of stuff, but I was willing to do that just because I was so obsessed with it. I came to find out that the Catholic Church had to go through quite a lot to make it legal for people to surrender portions of their trust and treaty funds. And I found how complicated. There's so many different streams of money that the federal government paid to Native people in exchange for their lands and resources. It was enormously complicated. They're not really trust funds as we think of them today. Some of them were designated as treaty funds. Some of them were individual trust funds, but they basically, went to no matter how they were defined, they were to enrich the community in some way, to provide for infrastructure, community services. So there was actually a lawsuit, a Supreme Court decision, called Quick Bear v. Loop in 1908, in which the Catholic Church prevailed and Native people were given, quote unquote, the choice to pay a portion of their trust and treaty funds over to pay before they got it. So it would never be in their hands, but they would sign a document allowing the federal government to send the money directly to the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions, which is the big administrative office that's located still today in Washington, D.C., that would oversee all of these monies. So then I wanted to know, well, how did they collect these signatures? For some reason, they did not have these documents. They were called petitions. But I totally stumbled across one in Kansas City at the Federal Archives. And what was really telling was that the names were all written in the same hand, but people designated their approval by pressing their thumbprint on out next to their names, and then the Indian agent would record their names. So they would, clearly many of the people were illiterate. This is dated from 1920. So, one, it was very interesting that the Catholic Church kept everything else associated with, because I think they were probably aware that this day might come sometime, that people would maybe want to hold them more accountable. But I think they were keenly aware that they did need to account for this. So finding that petition with those thumbprints, Then I, spoke to Alissa, and we talked about how are we going to really tell this story? Wouldn't it be just very powerful if we could find descendants of some of those people that made those thumbprints? And so we were able to do that. It was from the Red Lake Reservation in northern Minnesota, and we were actually able to find 2 of those people, descendants of those people, and we were able to get a sense of what. So it was like $40 then, in 1920 in Red Lake, Minnesota. But $40 cash money in Red Lake, Minnesota really meant a lot, particularly if you were living a subsistence lifestyle, if you're relying on hunting and fishing. That kind of money really meant a great deal to people. So I think that it told the story in a really, a real human, personal way. It really gave legs to the story.
Mm-hmm.
Andrea, tell me a little bit about going back to Puerto Rico, talking to women about this issue. I don't know. I feel like you absorbed a lot
Mm-hmm.
From the advocacy side, from the people you featured in your story, mothers. I don't know. Just talk to me a little bit about what it felt like to report this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there were 2 main components to my story. The first one was trying to get data around domestic violence in the island. We knew anecdotally that, the police doesn't track these cases super well. Different agencies collect different information. So there was one part which was just me looking at different sources, including Wayback Machine on the internet, and, piecing together these numbers and trying to make sure that they align with what the police was saying. The other part was finding the women that I spoke to. That was hard just because, domestic violence in Puerto Rico remains such a taboo issue. So trying to get people to, open up to me was like kind of tricky. At the beginning, we wanted to use a survivor as kind of like the connecting thread of the story. We ended up featuring her in the piece, but we could not use all of her story because she still resides near her abuser, even though they're not together anymore. And for her own protection, we decided that we needed to strip down a lot of the identifying details, which in one hand, as a storytelling device, like I found her experience to be very powerful, just because of the way that she interacted with the police. But at the same time, her protection was of the utmost importance. So I want to say, like in the fall, after my first reporting trip home, we came to the decision that, even though she was super game and it was like a lovely person who did not have to share all of her traumas with me, but did so anyway because she wanted to prevent other women from going through what she went through. Even though those considerations were there, like her safety was first. So then it was like a question of like trying to find a family of someone who had been killed and trying to get them to, tell us their process, which I feel is a little bit different. And we did find this family who had been pretty open with the media before, Sonia Nieves and Jesus Calderon Nieves. Sonia's daughter, Zuliani, was killed by her ex-husband in May of 2018. And it was one of those situations where she did not seek help from the police, but she did get a protective order that expired and a judge declined to renew it. And that basically allowed her ex-husband to see her and see their kids. And eventually he killed her in front of her 2 children. And it was this very traumatic, horrible, sad case. This was a woman who was like remaking her life. She had gone back to college. She was sharing her poetry. She was like a very lovely, amazing woman who died in such a horrific manner. But her family, again, just with the mentality of we don't want this to happen to other families, they just like were super generous with their time. And I think that I absorbed a lot of it. It was not easy sitting down and having conversation after conversation about the trauma of this women. And it took a while for me to like actually deal with it. I think I put it in a box in the back of my head for most of the reporting process. And when it was time to write, then it was kind of like, okay, let's unleash this. And it's not going to be pretty, but it's like a super important story. And the hope was that, by documenting this crisis and making this like record that there was going on, that would actually push lawmakers and the government to take this issue seriously, because to this day, the governor has this national alert and a working group with the national alert that started September 4 of 2019. And the working group was supposed to come with a draft that would say, here's how the government is handling domestic violence and how we're going to fix the issue. We still have not seen the draft today. It's been nearly a year. And one of my sources told me that one of the suggestions, instead of looking at creating a 911 line specifically for domestic violence victims, or, you know, looking at how the courts deal with this, or retraining police, no, those things don't matter. Suggestions they were discussing was, you know, making an education campaign against reggaeton, the music genre, which doesn't save women at all.
Mm.
Can you talk a little bit about going back home and reporting on this as a woman, a Puerto Rican, for an American audience, just kind of that journey for you of, you know, I mean, I think one thing that's important about the fellowship and the reason it exists is to have people, you know, who are outside what we see represent most investigative news teams, doing stories that only they think of or only they know about and they have access to, because they're, you know, not necessarily the people who are on the New York, you know, the big time investigative teams, right? Like, that's the goal, is to bring people from outside perspectives to do stories they feel really passionate about. And often they're stories that are not, that other reporters aren't digging into as deeply. So why, and I'll ask Mary, throw it to you after, but why was it significant that you are of this community and that, you know, you have a personal connection to this issue? Like, how, in what way did that help you? And in what way maybe was it challenging?
I think it definitely helped. And I already knew a lot of the context beforehand, right? I had an understanding of not only the issue, because I had not only reported on intimate partner violence individually, but also in the context of Puerto Rico post Maria. So I had an understanding of those nuances and like how the system worked or did not work, you know, who were the key players that I should reach out to and chase and ask, like, you know, who needed to be held accountable. So I had a lot of that context. And the other part was like, I understood my sources, right? Like I could sit down with them and talk in Spanish and like really make the case of, you know, this is an issue that it's important to me. And I think that this idea that reporters and journalists should be dispassionate and not have a connection to the issues they're working on, especially for investigations, it's kind of like a misguided idea, right? The reason why I chased the story so hard for a year and dedicated so much to it was because I really, really cared about this issue. And that did not mean I was gonna leave my sources who were kind of more like friendly than the government off the hook, right? Like I really questioned some of the work that the advocates were doing. The survivors and the family of Zuliani had to provide documentation for everything they told me. Like there were things that, you know, they said, but then they did not have ways to prove it. And I was like, well, that's not going on the story because I don't have, you know, documentation for what you're telling me. And, you know, not a lot of young Puerto Rican women are represented in mainstream media, American media specifically. And Puerto Rico has a very complicated relationship with the US. It's a colonial relationship. There's a lot of misinformation or just like ignorance about the island and how it works. So I also wanted people to care about this issue beyond just like, oh, these are our fellow American citizens. I wanted people in the United States to care about this issue because it's an important issue. And if it was going on in New York or LA or I don't know, Texas or Florida, you would care. So you should care the same just because it's in Puerto Rico.
Mm-hmm. And Andrea, one thing Andrea found was that in 2008, the number of women being murdered by their intimate partners was more than twice the average for the U.S. So the levels of violence were extremely high. So, Mary, do you want to kind of answer a similar question? I don't know exactly what the question was, but
well, that people of color, that somehow we, that we are questioned. I think that we are unable, quote unquote, to be objective. Objectivity is not the face of a white male. I'm still a journalist, and I'm still going to do my job. I'm not a propagandist, and that so diminishing to us as human beings to somehow to sort of say that, to paint this objectivity only as it seems like it has to be part of a certain gender and a certain ethnicity. And I'd always been taught that, being a suitable motivation for an investigation would be the desire to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, as H.L. Mencken, who was not really especially broad-minded racially, but I mean, he was a good journalist. And, I think that desire is a legitimate motivation to pursue an investigation. So I think that's really unfortunate, and that often discourages so many of us. And mainstream journalism often will label us as advocacy journalists, and I've been called that before. I don't know. So do you have to not be Native to report on Native people? Can we is it? I don't see a similar concern when we see white male journalists covering white male politicians. I don't think I've ever had any of those folks questioned if their ethnicity and their birthright would interfere with their objectivity, So no, nor does it with mine. Certainly it does. It certainly piques my interest more, perhaps because I have an experience in my family, and I think because I have that familiarity, I can really speak to some of the more details of what happened. Indian boarding schools. And also I've been writing about Indian country for a long time, and it's a complicated beat for anybody. It's a lot. Native people have a unique legal and historical relationship with the United States and the United States government, and it's a lot to know. I mean, not that I in any way, purport to know all of it, but at least I have an idea of who to ask if I don't know, which often is just, I feel like, half of the work anyway. So I think it's, I worked for mainstream media for a number of years, and I just kind of left because I got so demoralized and diminished by those sorts of accusations. And I felt like all of that really does is exclude coverage of huge members of our society, because somehow they don't fit into that box. In which I guess that that the sort of white male influenced institution of journalism values. So, I see this as a really seminal time right now that that we are we're being heard, although we've been hollering from this bully pulpit. I have been for a really long time, but I think that maybe people might be listening to us, that we do have really important journalism and investigations, to add, and we have important information that we can share. So I think it was just so gratifying. I'd wanted to do this, and I know a lot about it. I'm bothered by it and obsessed with it. And finally, I got the infrastructural support from Type Investigations. I got all of these primary documents. I would just madly be photographing all these primary documents because, the archivist was not really super open to me coming and looking at all of these really old documents. So I had this huge volume of documents. Now what do I do? How do I organize them? How do I make them retrievable? And which documents are important? So it was tremendously helpful to have this fellowship in those terms. I mean, the Type Investigations folks really helped me a lot. And so they were really patient. I think I was a little bit nervous, that I would be embarrassed at having to admit that I didn't know sometimes how to do things, but I never felt that. I always really felt lifted up and encouraged, okay, we chose you and we believe in what you're going to do, what you're doing. So I mean, it was and that was it. Once they made that decision, I felt okay, they're in this with me. And it was one of the most gratifying experiences of my whole life, I have to tell you.
That's so good. That makes me feel so happy because I picked you. So, so I want to keep this thread going, but I also want to remind folks who are listening in. We are about halfway point, so we're in our goal. Our idea is for us to stop talking, kind of open it up to the group for questions in about 10 minutes. So please drop anything you hear that you have a question about, if it's about the individual stories, about Andrea, about Mary, about the fellowship. Please click the ask a question button and get questions in there so we can, kind of broaden this outside of the three of us. So I think this idea, what you guys have both brought up, is, a major talking point right now in journalism. I wonder, we already kind of talked a little bit about some of the questions I had in mind about this idea of objectivity, neutrality. What does that mean in investigative journalism? Does that mean if you have an opinion because it's something you felt a personal impact of oppression in your life or in your family, that then you can't report on that? I feel like that's the way a lot of people have felt historically, and what people are pushing against. What do you both see right now in the universe, happening? And does it feel real? Does it feel valid? Does it feel like it's about time? I don't know. I'm just curious what your thoughts are around this kind of moment. Andrea, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, I feel like it's a long time coming, right? People of color and frankly other marginalized communities as well, right, have been calling out their own institutions internally for a while and being like, there's not enough of us to begin with, or we're stuck at the lower level staffer and we don't go up because we just leave because you are not retaining us, and that is like a loss for a lot of institutions. And this, going back to what Mary was saying, this idea of objectivity is frankly so retrograde to me. This comes from a time where the great majority of journalists were white men drinking in Mad Men with their cigars and their whiskey, coming from Ivy League schools, who had a very clear way of viewing the world. And that doesn't take away validity from the way that they view the world, but our perspectives matter as well. And, looking back, I think a lot about how Puerto Rico was covered after Hurricane Maria, and how there were a ton of non-Puerto Rican, non-Latino journalists who just did some parachute reporting, and they missed the mark. Absolutely. I remember this one article that had this line about how Puerto Ricans cried when they heard about La Madre Patria, about Spain. And I was like, La majority of Puerto Ricans do not care about Spain. Spain has not owned Puerto Rico for over 100 years. What are you talking about? And it was this detail that probably this person heard and found interesting, but myself as a Puerto Rican, I was like, this is BS. Someone was definitely trolling you, or this is such a small minority that it doesn't represent this entire community at all. And I feel I'm hopeful that newsrooms are listening, if anything, because it's affecting their bottom line, right? So I do hope that this moment leads to change, because we have incredible journalists who have left this profession just because they could not take it anymore. And those voices were super, super important. And I hope that, owners and editors-in-chief and managing editors take a really hard look at themselves and be like, how can we make our newsrooms more diverse and more inclusive? Because that's going to make our journalism so much better. At the end of the day, our coverage is going to be so much stronger. And that's what we should be striving for at this point.
Thanks, Andrea. So I have some questions. So I think I'm going to go ahead and throw these in here. And by the way, for folks who hopped onto this chat who don't know very much about type investigations, maybe we can throw in there our about just like some information about how you might be able to work with us, partner with us. But basically what we do, by the way, is we work with independent journalists. We also, through the IDB Wells Fellowship, work with staffers, but we support the investigative projects with money, editorial support, fact-checking, legal, everything you need to do an investigation, and we partner with all kinds of different outlets. So yeah, I think our website is the best place to kind of learn about how we do our work. But I know there's probably people on here who don't completely know what Type Investigations is. And our About page really provides a lot of that information. I just realized, like, you know, there might be people on here who don't understand the full gamut of what we do. So anyway, all right. So we have a question from Ernesto Aguilar. He says, what tips would you give media producers doing investigative work like this to get started, as well as keep momentum when things get difficult? So those are really good questions and really hard ones. If you guys have some thoughts that come to mind, go for it. How you get started, how you keep yourself going, and then I can, you know, add.
I guess that, you know, starting with your idea, it's always very good to have like the most you can get in an ideal perfect world, and then what realistically you can obtain throughout your investigation. So when I was looking at domestic violence, in my mind, I was like, I'm gonna get all this data from the police and the courts, and I'm just gonna like do all these graphs and all that. And then that became super hard to get. So it was kind of like, okay, let's narrow the focus and think about, you know, what's realistically what's out there, how can I get it, and will it go through like the fact checking and the legal process and stand as well. So I think that narrowing your idea a lot of times and being really honest with yourself is important. And, you know, this process took a year, and there were times where, you know, I was on fire, and it was like every week I was doing reporting, and then, you know, life happened. I changed jobs. In January, I was supposed to travel to the island, and the earthquakes happened, and I could not go. So that
I was like, go, Andrea, and then both of our bosses were like, no, please don't go.
Please don't go. So it was kind of like, you know, you're gonna hit roadblocks, and you just have to come to terms with the fact that there's some things that are out of your control. And if you're a type A person like myself, that's really hard to do. But, you know, the projects are very long and very intensive. And it's, you know, keeping yourself organized and being aware of like the news cycle was also very important. Like I was like, okay, so if the governor, like, you know, issues this draft out, do I have enough material to publish around that time? Okay, no, if not, how am I gonna get to that point? So yeah, that was a very convoluted answer. Like, Mary, do you have tips?
Well, you know, you have to know your subject. I mean, you do. I mean, you know, if you go off half-cocked, oh, that sounds good. I mean, you want to really know, is this good? And the way that you find that out is you do some reading and you do some investigation on your own. You know, after you do some work for a while, you kind of do develop somewhat of a sense of, boy, this is sexy. You know, as we used to say, I mean, sexy in terms of this is really, I haven't seen anybody write about this. It's really interesting. And then also the trends as well. I mean, we're really, you know, my piece, I think, fell at a really good time, because we are talking, you know, in I think our country, there's discussion regarding reparations, you know, not for Native people and for Black people. So, I mean, it really fell at an opportune time. You know, so those are sorts of things to keep an eye on. But you've got to like, I will say that going through the fact checking process, and I've been doing this for a while now, since really, you know, I started. I'm actually sort of embarrassed to say in the 80s, but I've been an independent journalist since 2003. This is the most robust fact checking experience I have ever gone through. It was, yeah, I felt like a lot. I had, yeah, I mean, yeah, it was very intense. It was very thorough. I was appreciative. It was a real learning experience. But yeah, I mean, I know more about treaties than I have ever known before. I read completely from front to back more treaties than I have ever read before. So, I mean, you know, because some of the fact checkers would be people who had no background. So, well, how do you know that? What does this actually mean? Okay, well, I've got to prove that. So, You do have to have some knowledge of it's good, I think, if you have experience in what you're wanting to write about. And of course, then you just have to have a passion for it. What can I say? This work gets in your blood and you kind of can't let it go. It's like, I mean, I often, I would wake up thinking about it. I'd go to sleep thinking about it. I dream about it. It sort of takes over your life in a kind of delightful, annoying way. But, so you kind of are born for it. And well, as I said, remember, I said I found out about this in 2014, and I was like, God, how can I get some support to do this? So it took me all this time, to get to do it. And I was able to continue to hold that torch, of interest. And there were times when I was like, why am I even doing this? Oh my God, I'd be up in the middle of the night reading this teeny tiny these letters are so tiny on these old congressional records from 1903 or something. But, then the next day you'd feel interested all over again. So, if you really want to do it, you'll do it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Good answers. So we got another good question here. I think this is an excellent question, actually. As an editor, how can I avoid tokenizing when I pitch an investigative assignment to a freelancer who's connected to the community that the reporting is built around? Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good question, right? You want to provide opportunities and you want to, assign stories to folks who are going to be passionate about it and going to run with it. And how do you do that in a way where someone doesn't feel, oh, you just want me to do this story because I'm of this background? I don't know. I'm curious.
What I've heard from freelancers, specifically around this watershed moment we've seen the last couple of months, is when editors were thinking of assigning to Black freelancers they did not know right at the peak of the George Floyd protest, they should not send that email and instead wait 8 weeks and then send an email and ask that freelancer, what do you want to write about? And I think developing that relationship prior will make writers feel like you're not tokenizing them, right? Like that you already have a report, you already know that this writer is interested in this subject matter. And therefore, when you're not just pigeonholing them, because I'm very interested in writing about Puerto Rico, and I'm sure that Mary's the same thing with Native issues, but there's a lot of people in our communities who do not care. They just want to write about sports or, entertainment or other things that are not related to their identity. So I think having that relationship prior is super, super important.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, often I would, in the past, I've had, during the freelance years, have people approach me with these very preconceived ideas. Well, we want you to do an investigation that finds such and such. And it's really based more on their perception of what Native peoples are. And often it's at best partially informed. So, why not just have a discussion with the person? It'd be good to build a relationship. What are you working on? What do you think is really important in your community? Related, maybe, obviously, you have some sort of an emphasis you'd like to, explore. But perhaps if you're a business publication or whatever, and I think that's okay. Certainly, it can be framed in that way. But I think you need to talk to the people and ask your freelance community, what is it you're working on, and what do you think is one of the more important issues you'd like to explore in your community, and why? So this is the kind of thing you would do with, I think, anybody else.
Right. Good responses. All right, we have one from Eileen Glow here, who's one of our current fellows, actually. At what point did you know that you had the story, whether it was the right character, the biggest policy contribution? And what was the process of getting there where you were like, okay, this is the story. This is, the problem with it's about the police department. It's about machismo. It's about, or with Mary, well, sure, these people chose to send their kids to Catholic boarding schools, but actually, they didn't have a choice, right? There were no other schools nearby, and these schools were assimilationist and abusive, right? When did you get to a moment where you understood the core question of your story?
I work kind of organically, and I always say that journalism itself is just a total leap of faith. You have to, when you go on assignment, it's like it emerges. You've just got to trust that it's going to emerge. And I don't know in many ways if it ever came to, it was like perfect. I still have some fear that something is going to come back to bite me on this thing. I'm used to, but I mean, one just still has that, right? I mean, because that's your makeup. You're ever questioning. You're ever questioning. I think when I was able to pass all of these doggone fact checkers, when I was able to pass that gauntlet, I felt that I really had something. But, I knew instinctively I did. And when I was able to find the descendants of those people, I knew that would give the story some legs, And I was also able to physically go. I went to the part of the boarding school that was still standing, and we got to walk in there with a descendant. I mean, that was magic. That I just felt. I mean, it was like the place was imbued with the spirits of the people who had been there, with the children who had been there, and that was very powerful.
Yeah, I think in my case, I had conversations with sources for a long time, and I had the data, and I knew this was clearly an issue. But the moment it clicked for me was when I had my big sit down with Sonia, the mom, in March. And I spent like 4.5 hours, 5 hours with her in her home. And, it was like a very complicated dance, to put it that way, right? We were talking about like really dark, traumatic stuff. And then, she would make me a smoothie. And then we would talk about astrology and angels, because she's like this woman of like faith and believes in all these things. And then we would go back and talk about, her daughter and who she was, and then the murder. And I think during that afternoon, evening, it kind of like clicked to me. It started like actually seeing how the lead and the nut graph and like the piece was gonna come. I actually think I went to bed that night and I could not fall asleep. I was like in my childhood room. And at some point I'm like kind of falling asleep, and I started thinking of the lead, and I just turned around, and obviously I did not want to look at my phone. So I just like recorded myself in Spanish and put it down, and then went back to bed. And that was actually the lead we ended up using. Like Alissa thankfully did not hate it. So I just like was like, like in that moment, I think throughout that conversation, I was like, not only I have all the like technical stuff, I also have the human part. And that on itself was what made the story super powerful.
It's interesting. Both of you talk about moments that happened recently. I mean, those were not in the first 8 months. Those were at the end. I mean, that was under a second time you went back was what, March in the end?
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, we were fact checking Mary's story a month before it ran. So yeah, I mean, that's really interesting to me that your answers go to these moments really far beyond the place where, you could have written a very convincing, like, pitch to an outlet or whatever, like, it takes a long time when something is so complex to feel like, okay, I've got it, Excellent. All right. So I'm going through, let's see, the next one, I'm just going in order. This one's for Andrea. Do you think the stress of living through major disrupting events in Puerto Rico contributes to the high level of domestic abuse, or is it something more endemic to life in Puerto Rico?
So it's two parts. The answer is yes to both. There's a ton of research that shows that natural disasters specifically are tied to an increase on domestic violence. We saw this after Hurricane Katrina, for example. Because obviously, like, people don't have access to healthcare or employment. In Puerto Rico, there was no power or water for months. Like, people were cut off from their communities. So obviously, like, the stress leads to an increase not only in the violence, but also the lethality of it. But another part is like Puerto Rican culture and like how it's a super conservative, machista, like patriarchal society that still has a long, long way to go to believe, in equality between the genders and to understand that intimate partner violence is a public health issue and it's not an issue of inside the home. So.
Great, thank you. So I have a question here that got voted up, so I'll go with that one. This is a very good one. What do you hope comes from your investigations besides public awareness, and how do you ensure these pieces create change? Which is always a hard thing with investigative journalism. So I don't know, I'm eager to hear what both of you think around those questions.
Well, I would hope that the Catholic Church would be, well, what I heard from a lot of my sources and people that just I talked to in general was they really wanted the Catholic Church just to admit what happened. I mean, and we're not talking about, reparations in terms of money or things, but just owning their history and opening up their records. To make it more easier for people. And it's a powerful experience to hear all this story. These stories you've been told all your life, about their family's painful past and what happened to us, and and not that you want to like make a pet out of these traumas, but they do infuse your life, and you start wondering. You question yourself. I think people of certain communities, we question ourselves. I mean, are we did these things even really happen? And actually seeing that and verifying that they did, I think it gives you some authority. And it, maybe at least for me, I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but it helps you move then. I mean, I think it is, as I said, it gives you some authority then to decide how you're going to move. So I think that was, that would be my great hope, is that there would be more transparency.
In my case, I do hope that it leads to changes in terms of like how the government is dealing with this crisis. The day after our investigation got published, Governor Vasquez signed into law this measure that would offer domestic violence training to municipal police. These are separate departments from the Puerto Rico police, which is like the main one. She never responded to my emails or my calls or anything. I'm not sure if she saw our investigation, but the timing was definitely interesting. So I hope that, we can see more of that. And there's several lawmakers who are working on, creating a state of emergency like advocates want, and to prioritize this crisis. And I hope that in many ways, this is like a document they can use, right? It's a resource not only for them to create policy change, but also like as an education resource for Puerto Ricans.
And can you talk a little bit about the community's response to your stories?
Yeah.
Native and Puerto Rican folks.
Yeah, I got a ton of like good feedback of like, people who were like, this is an issue we've been talking about for a long time. Thank you for spotlighting it. And my dad, for example, has a group chat, and some of his, middle-aged classmates from high school, came forward and said that they were survivors. And it really started a conversation on Twitter, on Facebook. And I think that, it was one of those moments where this is one issue that we all knew about. So just putting it down on paper, as Mary was saying, like it was empowering to say, hey, we are not insane. Like this is actually an issue that matters and that it's important that we deal with, because this violence against women is absolutely unacceptable.
And I'll say one of the first things that Andrea talked about back when we were interviewing her for the fellowship, at this point, a year and a half ago, was that she really wanted, part of the support she wanted with the fellowship, she said this several times, was to pay for the translation to Spanish. And so, we did it, obviously. We were like, yes, we can pay for this. But I think that shows her commitment to getting the story to people who can literally in their language. So yeah, we were able to do bilingual. Go ahead, Mary, what about you?
I had a lot of people respond favorably, and thank you for doing this. Actually, I think, I've shared with you, two of the sources, that I used in the story have passed away. One earlier this month, and he was 90, Frank Dickinson, and then Tom Darrigan passed away in, I think like in April. And, if we hadn't have, I'm sure that he talked to other people, but, their stories are really important, and the experiences they had were really important. And I'm glad I got to play some part in bringing those forward to people. I think people really appreciated that. Again, the real kind of hard validation of this happened and the quantification of it. I think people really appreciated that. Got a lot of response.
Good. And both of you were on TV and interviewed about it, and so that I think is significant too. You know, like there is, I don't know, just the fact that like there was pickup, there was interest, people wanted to ask questions and learn more about the story. I mean, that happened with both of you, and that it's hard sometimes with coronavirus and all this stuff to break through on stories that are not about the news of the day right now, and both of these stories really broke through, so that says something. So this story is, this question is for Andrea. How do you build trust with your sources, particularly when you're speaking to survivors of domestic violence?
Yeah, so I spoke with a ton of people that did not make it to the final piece, particular survivors. So basically, a lot of the survivors I got were through social media. I would just post like, hey, I'm looking for women who are survivors. We can keep you anonymous. Here's like my work and the coverage I've done. If you're interested, just hit me up. Here's my email, DM me, whatever. Those first conversations were off the record. I was just like, you can ask me whatever you want. I can tell you about this project. I can tell you about my childhood. I can tell you about my journalism. I just ask me anything. And, you create a report that way. And then we would move on to the heavier stuff and, having conversations on the record and asking for documentation and going back and asking follow-ups. And it's a really taxing process. All the survivors I spoke to, they all knew that they could pull out of the story at any time. And this is something we typically don't do as journalists, right? We don't give our sources the option to opt out when they are on the record. But in this case, I felt like it was important for them to have that option. And in case they were like, I cannot do this anymore, or my circumstances changed or anything, they always knew that was the option. So yeah, it was, creating a conversation and treating them with respect at all times, like when I had my big sit down with M, who's like the survivor in the story, she picked the place, she picked the time, she had someone nearby just in case, she needed some comfort. We would take breaks in between the interview, right? She would tell me all of these things. And then I was, okay, let's talk about this coffee we're drinking, or let's, talk about something else. And just reading their body language and being very aware that they're trusting you with like the most horrible things that, treat them as careful as you can, because they don't owe you anything. They did not need to sit down with me and tell me these things. So I wanted at all points to make sure that they were in control and they knew they were in control.
I wasn't asked that question, but I would, if it's okay, I would like to respond, because I've written about
I was going to ask you too.
You really do have to. It's very risky, and it's emotionally. It is. You have to be willing to do somewhat of the same thing that you're asking your sources to do. You have to, share of yourself. And my rule is that I want to be able to sleep at night, no matter what I do. I want to feel really honorable. That I've done the right thing, and that's the way I operate, and I'm just really upfront with people. And it can, sometimes people can just change their minds, and you spend all this time with them, and that's just the way it goes. But you never want to feel, I never want any woulda, coulda, shouldas when I'm done with this. I want to feel Willaney in a good way, about it. It is. I mean, you can't expect to get out totally clean from this life or from journalism. I mean, it is really emotionally risky. And so then you got to take care of yourself too. You remember, I mean, that's, that I think that's where that, that's based in fact, this hard journalists going out together, I mean, it's kind of because it's it's an emotionally draining job. So you got to take care of yourself.
So we have a minute. So I'll ask a really, if you guys want to put in one sentence, because we just have one last question. For journalists, especially freelancers aiming for fellowships like this, any advice for how to put together a successful application? What did you guys, obviously you don't compare your applications to people who didn't get them. I did, so I can speak a little bit about that. But if you guys want to talk about how you thought about putting together your applications?
I think that in my case, having like a different readers help you, and like have some people who you can talk through a story with, and like will give you feedback was super helpful. I enlisted my editor at the time, but it could be just like a good friend who's a reporter as well, or an editor, and just like hash it out. My partner also looked over, he's a journalist as well, so he looked over all my materials. And most importantly, like have confidence on your story idea. You know, like I made sure that in my interview with Alissa, I could like, you know, she could feel my passion through the screen, because I really believed in the story. And if you don't believe in the story, then who is gonna believe in it, right? So for me, it was very important just to be like, this is why it matters. This is how I'm gonna deliver. And, you know, obviously freelancers don't have the same support system as full-time staffers like myself have. But, you know, if you can find those like people in your life who are, you know, vouch for you and really push you, like, yeah, definitely like run your applications by them.
You know, the other thing is you're going to get turned down. My stuff was turned down. You know, I mean, it gets turned out, and you just go back and you know, you repackage it a little bit. And the other thing is, some of these fellowships, they don't tell you on the front end that they actually are. They have kind of an you know, an area in mind they'd like to focus on, and they don't necessarily share that with you. You know, so if you've fallen outside of that. You know, I got super lucky in one fellowship. I was just exactly hit the nail on the head. You know, and I think perhaps my talent may have entered into it a little bit, but you know, there's some of it is, you know, some of it is you can't be totally discouraged. It's sometimes, man, you can really believe in something and they have to shoot you right down. But you know, have somebody else read it, somebody who has some experience with journalism, have people read it, that's someone who's going to really give you some good criticism, and you know, just don't be afraid to go back and rewrite it.
And yeah, I'll add also really knowing your material, knowing what's been written, knowing what's been done before. You know, you don't want to submit something that then the editor or whoever can Google and be like, wait, but this bit has been done in all these places, and what is new here? You know, I think like really, really knowing the material in and out is, you know, even if my experience with a fellowship is, even if the person isn't, you know, we're still trying to figure out where the story lies, if they know and they're trying and they like have read stuff, and you mention this study and they're like, oh yeah, I read that study, you know, then there's a belief that, okay, they understand, they know this project, and they're gonna keep going until we together find the story, you know. For our fellowship, at least, you're not expected to come in having your story all wrapped up. That's why we have a year. But it's about like, you know, finding someone who is excited to learn, clearly shows that they're up for a challenge and will take, you know, is interested in learning and improving themselves too, doesn't feel like, well, I know all of it and here's my story and this is how I'm going to do it, but also, you know, has done their work and has done their research. I think those are things I really look for, a kind of attitude of openness, being excited, being really interested in taking on something new, being responsive when I ask questions, but also, you know, knows some good answers to most of the questions, you know. I think those are the things that matter for us a lot. So we are at time. I don't know if this thing shuts us off automatically, but we seem to still be broadcasting. So we will close up shop. Thank you everybody so much who participated, and those questions were excellent. And thank you, Andrea and Mary, so much. It's been wonderful to see you both. Now that your stories are done, I don't talk to you every week, so it's been lovely to hear your voice.
Feels so weird in a way.
I know. I'm like, you disappear at some point from my life. I'm like, that person's gone. So it's nice to see you both, and we will do another one of these really soon. So with a different group. So thank you everybody, and have a wonderful evening.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.